Hello, I'm Francisco and this is What the Book, the show where we use literature to talk about history. Before Blair Waldorf, there was May Whelan. Before Serena van der Woodsen, there was Ellen Olenska. And before Gossip Girl, there was The Age of Innocence by Edith Wharton. Wharton was the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, winning it in 1921. She grew up in a rich family in New York City in the 1870s, which if you saw my video about the Gilded Age, you will know it means she grew up in a very interesting time in American history. The economy was deregulated, poor people were getting poorer, rich people were getting richer, and American society was at a crossroads. Should they be allowed to become a tired, aristocratic society just because they had a ton of money? Or was that a betrayal of the ideals of freedom and equality that made them want to invent the United States of America in the first place? It's important to note that The Age of Innocence was published in the 1920s, almost 50 years after the Gilded Age. So Wharton was actually writing about a society that didn't exist anymore after World War I, the Roaring Twenties, and a society that had the Great Depression in its very near future. This is why The Age of Innocence is a very interesting book. If read at a superficial level, it just showed snapshots of a glamorous, bygone society. If analyzed a little more carefully, it actually offers a strong criticism of this same society, showing it as an artificial and contradictory time bomb of conservative tradition and liberal ideals. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. If you've seen Gossip Girl, the plot may sound familiar to you. It's New York City in the 1870s, and we are introduced to Newland Archer, a successful lawyer in his early 20s who spends his time criticizing the traditions of New York high society while also following them without question. May Whelan, Newland's fiancée, is the perfect New York City rich girl, both in how educated and proper she is, and in how boring her expectations of life are. She was raised to be the perfect wife and mother, and that's it. She wants nothing else. And last but not least, we have May's cousin, Countess Ellen Olenska. She is blonde, older than May, knows a lot about art and literature, but she is also married to a mysterious Polish count, and is unexpectedly back in New York without a ticket to go back to her husband anytime soon. As it turns out, Ellen's marriage to the Polish count is very unhappy, and she came back to America with the scandalous help of her husband's secretary. There she finds young and hot Newland Archer, who is all like, "You're hot." And Ellen is like, "I know, but thank you." And May is like, long story short, Newland and Ellen fall in love because she's so interesting and he's very interested. But when the time comes for Newland to disappoint May by leaving her for Ellen, he's all like, and May is like, "I'm pregnant." And Ellen is all like, "Oh." So Ellen gets out of the way by going back to Europe. Time passes, Newland and May have a loveless marriage for decades, they have children together, eventually she dies of old age, and at the very end of the book, Newland goes to Paris with his oldest son, who gives him a chance to see Ellen again after all these years. And he refuses. The end, no one is happy, rich people can't ever know love. The first historical theme we're going to talk about here is liberalism in the United States. The book is about New York high society, and these people are rich, but not because they're part of a monarchy or handling government matters. They live in the United States under a government that points out how they are all equal and entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They are also rich because their families, most of them immigrants with clearly immigrant last names like Beaufort and Manson and van der Luyden, worked for it, using their individual perspective to come up with ways to make money which their children can later inherit and make more money. Some of them are richer and therefore more influential, but in general, none of them have a permanent status making them superior to others. If they lose their money, like the Beauforts, they also lose their social status. This is a good example of how political liberalism, all these ideas about rights and equality, tend to be linked to economic liberalism, all these ideas about free enterprise and the use of money as a signifier of achievements in rich people's minds. Edith Wharton is discreetly critical of this when she has Newland Archer think things like, "In matters intellectual and artistic, Newland Archer felt himself distinctly superior of these chosen specimens of old New York gentility. He had probably read more, thought more, and even seen a good deal more of the world than any other man of the number. Singly they betrayed their inferiority, but grouped together they represented New York, and the habit of masculine solidarity which made him accept their doctrine on all the issues called moral. He instinctively felt that in this respect it would be troublesome and also rather bad form, to strike out for himself. What's happening here is Wharton is pointing out how it doesn't make sense to combine the ideals of the United States, like individual perspective, with the behavior of rich people trying to become richer. But rich New Yorkers combine them anyway. Newland hated being a part of this society, presumably because he was educated and sensitive to an extent, but what he would have hated more would be to not be a part of it. With this in mind, the second historical theme we're going to talk about is conservatism in the United States. What the rich believe in the Age of Innocence is a huge contradiction, because they claim to be liberal, but on the other hand, they are actually aspiring to be good conservatives, with the privilege of having the option to give up the more cumbersome and difficult parts of being part of a rigid social structure. An example of this is when Ellen Olenska comes back to New York, and her aunt, Mrs. Lovell Mingott, wants to throw a dinner party to introduce her to society. However, everyone knows she's there because she left her husband back in Poland, and while they have no justification for it, they simply don't want to be associated with a woman that breaks tradition by leaving her husband. New York society was, in those days, far too small and too scant in its resources for everyone in it, including livery stable keepers, butlers, and cooks, not to know exactly on which evenings people were free. And it was thus possible for the recipients of Mrs. Lovell Mingott's invitations to make cruelly clear their determination not to meet the Countess Olenska. What's proper to New Yorkers at this time is not to treat each other as equals, but to emulate conservative British traditions when it was useful to them, like when they wanted to exclude divorcees like Ellen Olenska, but not if it meant making less money. The author, Edith Wharton, is extremely critical of this stance because she suffered from it herself when she divorced her own husband in real life in 1913. Ellen, who seems to have a lot of autobiographical elements of the real Edith Wharton, except being a little less of a rule breaker than the real Edith Wharton, points it out when she says, "It seems stupid to have discovered America just to make it into a copy of another country. Do you think Christopher Columbus would have gone through all that trouble just to go to the opera with the self-rich Marys?" Which leads us to our third historical theme, gender roles in 19th century America. On one hand, unlike in Europe, divorce was already illegal in the United States, and women were legally allowed to make a life of themselves without a husband. But on the other hand, Americans in the book kind of act like that's not the case. Everyone in New York high society rejects Ellen for wanting to divorce her philandering husband, and Newland Archer is all on board with it because he's in love with Ellen. Who had the right to make her life over if she hadn't? I am sick of the hypocrisy that would bury alive a woman of her age if her husband prefers to live with harlots. But then, when thinking about his own fiancée and later wife May, Newland is all like, there was no use in trying to emancipate a wife who had not the dimmest notion that she was not free. And he had long since discovered that May's only use of the liberty she supposed herself to possess would be to lay it on the altar of her wifely adoration. On one hand, he wants Ellen to be free to divorce her husband so he can be with her. But on the other hand, he doesn't want her to be free because that would go against tradition, which May so happens to be really good at following. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. Tradition is comfortable. Why break the rules if it's so unpleasant and so uncomfortable to not know what's gonna happen with your life? So Newland is a hypocrite when it comes to the women in his life, but a huge part of the conflict in the book actually comes from the women themselves being individuals. And wow, everyone is surprised that women have ideas and individual perspective. Ellen turns out to be more sensitive than anyone expects, and May turns out to be more manipulative than anyone expects, both in a society that doesn't care what women think as long as they perform their proper duties. And this is a huge departure from how things would play out in modern society. When Newland is building up the courage to leave May for Ellen, nowadays we would expect some kind of confrontation between May and Ellen, all like, but in the Age of Innocence, rules happen to be more important than feelings. May lies to Ellen, saying she's pregnant after her wedding to Newland, and they're both just like, oh. And that's that. Newland could theoretically still divorce May and run away with Ellen, but tradition says no. In the book, Ellen can actually be read as being a little sarcastic about the behavior of her fellow New Yorkers. When Newland first tells her about how he's marrying May, Ellen asks if the marriage is arranged, and the following exchange happens. Have you forgotten that in our country we don't allow our marriages to be arranged for us? Yes, I'd forgotten. You must forgive me if I sometimes make these mistakes. I sometimes forget that everything here is good that was bad where I've come from. Because the truth was, maybe America was already the land of the free, but the people living there would not feel truly free for many years to come. This video was actually made with the help of some of my students who read this book and presented it to their class. I hope you learned something. See you next time.